All right, everybody, we are back with section 4 of our new public policy course. Today we're going to talk about how people make decisions. Okay, and have you ever really thought about how people make decisions? Like, you know, what are you going to have for dinner tonight? What are you going to major in college? All kinds of different decisions we have to make, from the normal everyday decisions to big major decisions. Well, when we're talking about policy, that's a lot of decisions that people have to make in order to advance any given policy or decide on what policy to choose, how to vote on laws. All kinds of different decisions need to be made during this giant process. Now, there are lots of different kind of theories as to how people make decisions, from socialization processes to just going with your gut, to you're gonna vote the way your parents voted, to all kinds of other things. But we're going to examine kind of 3 theories of how people make decisions that are kind of specific to policymakers, or can be very clearly applied to policymakers. So the first one here is rational comprehensive theory. Okay, not to be confused with rational choice theory from my criminology course, but honestly, they're relatively similar. Now, the rational comprehensive theory says that decisions are made in a very ordered, logical way, right? So, step number 1, there's a problem. A person recognizes the problem. Crime is very high, right? Second step, we have to have goals, values, and objectives, and we need to rank them, right? What's more important, reducing crime, or the happiness of citizens, or respecting people's rights, or spending lots of . So we have all these kind of objectives, all these goals, and some of them are going to be in conflict. For instance, reducing crime is probably going to cost some money. So at what point does the money costs outweigh the value of the reduction in crime? So we have to kind of determine what our goals and values and objectives are and figure out what's more important than what, right? Step 3, we examine the options. We look at all the different possible decisions we could make. Maybe pull in some new ones. We have to kind of closely examine them all. For each one of those, we then calculate the probable consequences. Obviously, we can't know for certain what the consequences would be for any given decision, but with more or less certainty, we can kind of estimate what those consequences will be, whether they'll be good, whether they'll be bad, whether they'll be big, whether they'll be small, those kinds of things. Then, based on those consequences, we compare all the alternatives. Costs, benefits. This one will cost less, but it'll have a lower impact. This one will cost more, but it'll have more of an impact. This one is more likely to actually get passed. This one is not. We have to kind of compare all those different choices we had. And then finally, we choose the one that maximizes our goals, values, and objectives that we had previously ranked way back in step 2, right? Now, a lot of criticism of this theory. First off, problems aren't always clear, right? Especially the causes of problems like crime, right? If crime starts going up, what's the actual problem, right? It's not the crime itself necessarily, but the cause of that crime. And that's not always clear, right? And the second, it assumes a lot of knowledge. It assumes that the decision maker is nigh on omniscient, right? It assumes that they know what all the alternatives are. It assumes they have a very good idea, can at least closely estimate what the consequences of any given alternative will be. And it assumes that they know and understand and logically can see certain information that they might not have, right? Values are very difficult to rank. Um, you know, it can be very difficult for somebody to honestly and openly say, oh, well, if it in a conflict between this and this, clearly the big one here is the first one. Well, the realities of situations a lot of times make values very difficult to determine and difficult to decide on and difficult to rank, right? And then finally, it assumes a singular decision maker. It assumes one person is making this decision, whereas in reality, especially when it comes to public policy, it's usually a whole group of decision makers, not just one person. So the second theory we're going to talk about is called incremental theory. So this is where kind of, instead of seeing goals or values or objectives and then the action required to achieve those as different, they see them as intertwined. They see them as very heavily related, right? And when it comes to incremental theory, instead of doing all the work to examine all the alternatives and look at all the possible consequences and all those things, we're just going to pick a few alternatives that seem to be promising, and we're only going to look at a few of the consequences that seem to be important. We don't necessarily care about, oh, there's a small chance that this might happen, or, oh, there's this other alternative, but honestly, there's no real feasibility behind getting that passed via the policy-making process. So we're just going to look at a few alternatives. We're only going to consider a few of the more important consequences. We're going to acknowledge that the problem is constantly changing, right? Problems are almost never static. You look at things like crime or unemployment or education, and we can say that, crime is always a problem, but the degree of problem changes over time and changes based on geography and changes based on all kinds of things. So when we're making decisions, we need to acknowledge that problem might be different tomorrow than it is today. Might be different the next state over than it is in our state. It acknowledges that there is no right decision. There is no correct decision. There is only kind of, this will help here, that decision will help there. Everything has positives and negatives, etc., etc. So, but what's important is it's very step by step by step. This process results in incremental change, hence the name incremental theory, right? We're going to not necessarily come up with a big giant new policy. We're just going to slightly change old policies. See what effect that has, slightly change that policy again. So it's much more of a small step, reevaluate, keep looking at the problem, another small step. So this is very good for kind of normal day-to-day things, but it's not so good for, where we need big decisions, where we need big change, right? But it does acknowledge also that it's not one person making a decision. There are lots of people who are involved in this decision-making process. Each one gets input. Each one gets a view. It also acknowledges that we don't have infinite knowledge, and we don't have infinite time, and we don't have the infinite energy to examine every single alternative and every single consequence and all these things. So it's a much kind of faster, easier process to do. But on the other hand, that can be a downside too, right? Because if we just get stuck on the alternatives that we've been kind of handed on a silver platter, that's going to prevent us from going out and finding other alternatives that might be a heck of a lot better than the alternatives that are right there in front of us, right? So there's something to be said for actually finding choices that are not necessarily the big ones, the previously discussed ones, if you will. It's difficult to make major changes. Again, incrementalism is all about kind of small changes, which may over a long period of time add up to a major change, but sometimes we need those major changes in a much shorter, more realistic time scale such as when, a 9/11 happens or a COVID pandemic happens or something. And then finally, the biggest kind of detriment to incrementalism is that it benefits elites, right? Because if the elites have set up the system in a certain way, it's going to take a long, long, long time before incrementalism changes it to be a system that doesn't benefit elites, if ever, right? So kind of keeping the status quo or keeping closer to the status quo as incrementalism does will help benefit the people who set up the system, i.e. the rich, the powerful, the connected, etc. Now, mixed scanning. This is kind of a combination of both. And the person who came up with this idea actually had a really good, really interesting kind of metaphor to use to describe this, and it was weather satellites, right? So with a weather satellite, if you want to take pictures of the Earth's surface to see, where clouds are and where rain is happening and all those things, you kind of have two choices in camera, right? You have a big wide camera that can give you a big giant picture of lots of the Earth's surface, or you can get a really focused camera that can only take a picture of a small part of the Earth's surface, but gives you much more detail on that small part than the big, wide, broad camera will. And what's really important is that weather satellites don't have to choose one or the other. They do both, right? They use the wide cameras to kind of figure out what's going on in a general sense, and they use the small cameras, the focused cameras, to take more detailed pictures of the areas that need more information, right? So the idea here is to use incrementalism for smaller stuff, more everyday stuff, and then when something big is needed or when some crisis happens, use the rational comprehensive model to make bigger changes at a faster pace. All right. I hope you enjoyed that subsection. Be back in just a minute.